Hello there, so I'm Prajnagita and I'm living here in Therigatha. So I'm just going to give a talk today as part of our series of talks for the Great Gathering. And in my talk today, I'm going to be sharing a verse from the Therigatha that I found inspiring, and I hope to share some of my own personal responses. So it's a very short verse. Here it is. Practice the Buddha's teaching, you won't regret it. Right now, wash your feet and sit down beside him. So this verse was uttered by a woman, a nun in fact, called Vishaka. And we don't actually know that much about her, except that she was a follower of Mahapajapati and formed part of the first 500 community of nuns. So Mahapajapati was, if you remember, the first ordained nun. She was the founder of the women's order and the first woman teacher in the Buddha's time. What else we know is that Vishaka was from the Shakyan clan, and we also know that she was part of Siddhartha Gautama's harem, which he left behind when he went forth in search of the truth sometime earlier. So having a harem would have been quite normal for a wealthy clansman of India at the time. It would have consisted of wives, of children, of concubines, dancers, relatives, but generally the women's wing of the family set up, as it were. And we're told that Vishaka, alongside 6 other women from the harem, joined the order of nuns. There is, when I was doing the reading, I noticed that there is another Vishaka who features quite prominently as one of the Buddha's foremost very wealthy lay disciples, and of which a lot is written, but according to a few sources, it's unlikely that it's the same Vishaka. And there is another Vishaka, it's a male Vishaka, who was the nun Dhammadinna's former husband, and who is said to have been instructed by her. So I just wanted to mention that because there's a few people of the same name, as it were. But it's a short verse, and either way, it jumped out at me, and so I just wanted to share with you a few reflections on why it felt, why it jumped out at me. So I'll read it again. Practice the Buddha's teaching, you won't regret it. Right now, wash your feet and sit down beside him. So I feel it's a really strong exhortation. Practice the Buddha's teaching, she says, and you won't regret it. When I was reading this, I was particularly struck by how much this is less of the stick and more of the carrot approach to getting us to practice. So often I think we're led by what we want to get away from our ills, from our sufferings, and I think many of us are motivated to practice because we suffer and because we want a way out of our suffering. We want it to end. I tend to think of this as the stick approach, the stick of suffering, striking us, and maybe even striking us pretty hard and motivating us to practice. And I think it's quite a universal place from which many of us have come onto the Buddha's path. It may well have been the case for Vishaka. And if we think of, in a way, if we think of what her life might have been like in the harem. And I know that it was the case for me. I was very fortunate to be raised in a very comfortable, a very stable family in Ireland. I feel really grateful for the supportive, loving, encouraging conditions of my home and friends. And yet from a very young age, I found myself in touch with a very deep existential suffering. There were probably contributory conditions to this, primarily being quite a sensitive child. And also we lived abroad a lot and we travelled around a lot at quite a young age with my family. And in a way, I think this meant that I experienced quite a lot of leavings and partings, saying goodbye to people over many of my early years, in a way knowing I would never really see them again. So from a young age, I found myself in touch with this quite deep existential suffering, in a way connected to the truth of impermanence. And as a result, I began asking questions about the meaning of life, probably from around the age of 12. Fortunately for me, after many years of searching for answers, trying all sorts of weird and wonderful things, I did eventually find the Dharma at the age of 22 at what was known then as the Double Meditation Centre in Ireland. And with that, I felt that I finally found a path that would mean the end of suffering and in pursuing that path that I would have a meaningful and purposeful life. So this being in touch with suffering and the desire to end suffering definitely got me on the path. But these days I find that I have often got to dig deeper than just the alleviation of suffering for the motivation to practice. What I think can happen is that after a while of deepening into our meditation, our ethics, connecting with others, understanding a little bit more about the nature of our minds and the world around us, I think after a while in our going for refuge, we might find that we've become a little happier and a little healthier as a human being. And maybe the conditions that got us first on the path are no longer hitting us so hard from behind. So it's not that mine or anybody else's suffering is no longer an issue, but it may be that it's not so much to the fore. My life might be pretty good overall. And I think consequently it might be harder then to find the motivation to practice, and we may even drift or coast along for a while, on our merit perhaps. But then slowly, again, things begin to change until we encounter enough suffering and feel motivated to practice. And if this is something that's happening to you, as it did with me, then what is it that will keep us going for refuge at these times? What will keep us continuously deepening into our going for refuge? I think part of the answer is in understanding correctly that the Buddha chose to direct our attention to the alleviation of suffering really only as a skillful means. So what moves us to action when we think about it is not an idea about something, not a theory or a philosophy, though I think ideas and philosophies can be intellectually exciting and stimulating. But I think what really moves us into action is our emotions. We're really driven by our emotions. And that being the case, the Buddha could see that our experience of suffering would, in a way methodologically speaking, be a good starting point to set us on the path. In a way, this was his skillful means. He had a very practical, down-to-earth approach to getting us to practice. Unfortunately, though, I think then what can happen is that we can fall into a limiting view of thinking that the end of suffering is all there is to it. That perhaps this is the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. And it is true that when we arrive at the goal of enlightenment, there will be no more suffering. But Bodhi, awakening, is so much more than that. So Bodhi is not just the absence of suffering. It's a spiritually rich experience. It's a spiritually positive experience. And while the sort of full enlightenment experience is very difficult for us to describe, because to do so would be to limit it in terms of our current dualistic understanding, so much in the scriptures point to the Buddha's spiritually rich inner life. So we hear of clarity, illumination, calm abiding, compassion. And then there's more sort of poetic descriptions of enlightenment, like the further shore or the cool cave. And one of my personal favourites is a delightful stretch of ground. So this is what I think will keep us going for refuge and continuously deepening into our going for refuge, particularly when our life is going well. It's understanding correctly that the Buddha chose to direct our attention to the alleviation of suffering in a way really only as a skillful means. And we need to recognise that Bodhi, that awakening, is so much more than that. So when Vishaka says, practice the Buddha's teaching, you won't regret it, this is what I hear. So she's saying, come practice, you won't regret it. This path is going to be spiritually full, spiritually positive, mysterious, yes, but joyful, and we won't regret it. And with that, I feel drawn ever more forward with renewed motivation. So this is Vishaka dangling the carrot. We could say even that she's practicing skillful means here because she's engaging our emotions in a different way, with the sweet promise of something really, really fine, enticing us forward towards greater awareness, greater clarity, expansiveness, connectedness, love. So then she goes on to say, right now wash your feet and sit down beside him. So right now, she says, she tells us not to delay. We have little time. Life is brief. Life, as we've been experiencing it this year due to coronavirus pandemic, it's really, really unexpected. We can't really know what's around the corner. None of us would have predicted that this is a situation we would have found ourselves in 2020. So right now, she says, turn our attention to what is important. Turn our attention to what it is that we value. Take the opportunity now to meet the Buddha, to sit beside him, to spend time with him, to hear what he has to say. So there's a sense of urgency, an urgent call to practice. And this urgent call to practice includes washing our feet. So right now, wash your feet, she says, and sit down beside him. So I think there's various ways that we can read this imagery of washing one's feet before we sit down beside the Buddha. Personally, this image is a really powerful one, no doubt because of my Roman Catholic conditioning, where the tradition of feet cleaning was first demonstrated by Jesus to his disciples as a mark of humility, which in and of itself is quite innocent. Unfortunately, though, for me, sometimes along this kind of imagery are not very helpful connotations of being a sinner, only to be accepted back into the fold by the grace of God. So if you've got similar conditioning to me, you might need to be on the watch for similar responses. But we can instead think of this custom of washing our feet as a mark of respect, like we do when we take our shoes off entering a sacred space, or in some cultures where they take their shoes off before entering a domestic space. And even though the Buddha was a wanderer and didn't have a home, in a way his home was the forest or the village, we can still show our respect by, in a way, washing our feet before we sit beside him. And I think we can also remember that Vishaka was a former member of a harem, of the Buddha's harem, and that perhaps this symbolism of cleaning one's feet really represents for her a sort of a dusting off or a washing away of any of the limitations of her previous life and stepping into new possibilities, stepping into freedom. I kind of like to think of it in that way. I think, though, more significantly for me, this image of washing our feet is an indication that a certain level of receptivity or preparation is necessary before we enter into the Buddha's presence, before we receive the teachings. I think in a way we can think of this washing our feet as a way of developing receptivity before we sit down beside the Buddha. And in his book, The Bodhisattva Ideal, Sangharakshita says something really interesting about receptivity. He says that it's not a passive activity. So I think sometimes we can think of receptivity as kind of not having to do anything from our side, a kind of going seated, going passive and just opening up in a passive kind of way. But he says that receptivity requires us to actively create the space within ourselves so that something new can emerge. I think that's really significant. So he says when we're being receptive, we're stopping doing certain things. We're stopping limiting behaviours, limiting views. And in a way, when we stop doing something, we create the space for something new to arise within our experience. Bhante Sangharakshita says, receptivity means that one should be prepared for a radical change in one's whole mode of being, one's whole mode of life, one's whole mode or way of looking at things. So I really like that. We can become receptive by stopping or letting go of limiting ways of being. And we can do this, we can become receptive through a regular practice of ethics and meditation, so that we come into the Buddha's presence ready to meet the Buddha. We're ready for that radical transformation, that radical change. Right now, she says, wash your feet and sit down beside him. So what a wonderful opportunity those disciples in the Buddha's time had, that they could sit together with him, they could learn directly from him. Imagine too what it might be like for Vishaka, who previously lived in the harem with the Buddha, to now be able to be in a position to just sit down beside him and listen to his teachings. And granted, we can't actually sit with the Buddha, but there are other ways I think we can cultivate an intimacy with him, other ways that in a way we can sit down just beside him. And I think I would even go so far as to say that as we progress on our spiritual journey, we must find ways in which we can sit down with the Buddha. To sit with the Buddha really means to cultivate an intimacy with the embodiment of enlightenment. It means to really find for ourselves what Bhante calls a vivid embodiment of enlightenment within our own experience, or a vivid embodiment of the ideal within our own experience, or the transcendental within our own experience. And when I was thinking about this talk, I realised that when I sit with the Buddha, I'm not only cultivating an intimacy with him, but I'm also cultivating an intimacy with the two other precious jewels, the Dharma and the Sangha. So when I sit to meditate, I like to meditate with the Buddha. I like to imagine myself sitting in a forest or in an olive grove, and I'm surrounded by all the disciples of the Buddha, going back throughout the ages. So the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, the theris and theras, nuns, monks, lay, of all times, and including all the friends and mitras of our current order, of our particular Sangha as well. And generally, in this forest or olive grove with all the Sangha sitting around me, the Buddha is in front. He's sitting in front of all of us. And I like to get a sense of the Buddha in his human form. I like to get an embodied sense of him. So I try and get a felt sense of myself in my body, and remember that Siddhartha Gotama also had an embodied sense, a felt sense of himself in his body. It helps me connect. It inspires me because, like the Puja says, what he has attained, I too can attain. And I particularly like this quote from Jane Hirschfeld, which I think expresses this aspiration really simply but really beautifully. So she says, "I know there are supposed to be preserved footprints of the Buddha, which are kept in one of the sacred places of India or Nepal. And you can stand in them. And if you stand in them, maybe you realize, 10 toes, me too." And sometimes I like to imagine his dark, dry, slightly cracked skin, or see the faded colour of his dusty robe. And at other times he just sits there glowing quietly, with lovely golden colour. And when I imagine sitting with the Buddha in this way, or in the grove or in the forest, I find that I can just sit there with an open heart, without expectations. There's no particular need for me to do anything, except to be receptive to the Buddha, to be receptive to the presence of the Buddha. And in my mind's eye, in the forest or in the grove, the Buddha is generally silent. Though sometimes we, the community of disciples around him, sometimes we chant together, and that evokes a sense of gratitude and reverence. So sitting with the Buddha in this way is, for me, sitting with the historic Buddha. In the language of the Mahayana, when one speaks about the historical Buddha in this way, who was embodied, who lived and walked the earth, then we're referring to the Buddha as the Nirmanakaya Buddha, which means something like constructed body in Sanskrit, so kaya meaning body, constructed body. And so the Nirmanakaya is one aspect of the Buddha that I like to sit with, inspired by the possibility that we too can become like the Buddha. And though not insignificant to sit with the historic Buddha in this way, according to tradition, though, it's the most limited way that we can actually sit with him, which is interesting. There are two other more significantly deeper levels in which we can sit with the Buddha. So the next level in which we can connect with the Buddha is through the Sambhogakaya, which means the body of mutual enjoyment. I'll say a bit more in a minute. And the ultimate way in which we can connect with the Buddha is through the Dharmachaya, or the body of truth. So with the Sambhogakaya, the Buddha's influence manifests through mythic and archetypes, so through the mythic and archetypal realm. It represents Buddhahood as manifesting on higher or glorified archetypal planes, in a way above and beyond the historical context. Usually it's said that the Sambhogakaya Buddha is an aspect of the Buddha where he communicates with other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But we too, as mere mortals as it were, can connect with the Buddha in this way. Certainly in our tradition, as order members, we engage at this level through our sadhana practice, where we can open up to this archetypal level of the Buddha's influence, but even through the going for refuge and prostration practice, where we're sitting with all those figures on our tree of refuge and respect. This is us opening up to that archetypal level, that Sambhogakaya level. So my own sadhana practice is in fact a Buddha Shakyamuni practice, though as you know there are many other forms of the enlightenment experience that we can dwell on, that we can have as a sadhana practice. And I should say that it's only a few years ago that I really began to develop a meaningful connection with the Buddha, despite 25 years of being a Buddhist. And it came about, in a way, much to my surprise, when I asked myself, well, what image of enlightenment is most relevant to me? I asked myself, well, if I were to think of an image of enlightenment that meant something to me, what would it be? And the Buddha appeared in all his blazing golden glory. So I realized that the Buddha was my core archetypal image of enlightenment, and the golden light in particular seemed to emerge really strongly through my connection with him, and that was deeply affecting for me. Though Green Tara was the sadhana that I took at my ordination, after talking it through with my preceptor, I did take up the Buddha Shakyamuni sadhana, and I've been faithful to that since. I say all that because it might be useful for yourselves to ask that question. Well, what is the image that is most relevant to you or best represents enlightenment for you? And Subhuti speaks quite a bit about it if you want to read up in Reimagining the Buddha. It may be useful not to take this word image too literally, because sitting with the Buddha in this way may emerge in terms of qualities and presence. Maybe not take the word image too literally. So this is sitting with the Buddha in the more archetypal sense, sitting with the Buddha through sadhana, opening up to a visionary level, a visionary experience of the Buddha. And then sitting with the Buddha in the final sense is meeting the Buddha directly as reality. This is meeting the Dharmacharinis Buddha, the body of truth, which represents Buddhahood above the historical plane, above the archetypal plane, just as reality itself. And in a way, this is where the Buddha's influence is unlimited, because at this level, we're just encountering reality itself. The Dharmakaya Buddha is unlimited and not bound by any sort of physical or archetypal form. It's just reality. It's the truth, and the contact with it utterly transforms us. Which is why I imagine Vishaka is saying, we won't regret it. And I was thinking, well, rather than just sort of thinking that, well, sitting with the Dharmakaya is still a way off, I think this is where the Dharma jewel can come to the fore. Because when we sit with the historic or with the archetypal Buddha, we'll need to do this alongside an ever-deepening understanding of the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings. And in this way, that means that we have a context for what we're experiencing to unfold. So one of the ways I try and do this, above and beyond sort of study groups that I'm in, or the retreats that I'm going on, or even the books that I'm reading, is by always pursuing a dharmic thread of reflection. So always trying to keep alive an aspect of the teaching that has either caught my interest, imagination, and dwelling on it, or by taking stock of my current unfolding experience and trying to understand it with a dharmic perspective. Even asking myself at those times, what would the Buddha do with this particular experience? So in this way, sitting with the historic Buddha, dwelling with the archetypal Buddha, and filled up with the Dharma knowledge based on our own experience, we will be ready to meet the Dharmakaya Buddha, reality just as it is. So Vasika's verse, one final time. Practice the Buddha's teaching. You won't regret it. Right now, wash your feet and sit down beside him. Thank you.